Chapter 65, The Prisoners, Antony's POV. Hanyu was still in the middle of his breakfast when there was a knock at their door. Antony waved his offering back to his meal and rose to answer it, nursing a sudden knot of unease in his belly. Was it Marcus again? Had he somehow found out about Antony's breakdown with Theo? That was ridiculous. Theodore was hardly likely to seek his lover out for confidences, but still... Julia and Felix stood in the hallway side by side. Antony's quick rush of relief dissolved into a new irrational fear. Were they there to drag him to apologize to each of his former offerings? He still planned to do it, but he'd hoped to get a chance to ask Felix a little more about the men first, so he could personalize his confessions. "May we come in?" Julia asked, and Antony realized that he was blocking the door. He stood aside and gestured them in. "Of course." Wide-eyed, Hanyu dropped his spoon and started to rise from his seat, but everyone spoke at once. Antony's "no need" was swallowed by Felix's instruction, accompanied by a cheerful smile to sit down, this is just a friendly visit." Neither of their voices was as loud as Julia's. "Finish your meal, son. Food is important." Hanyu dropped back down into his seat, and Antony couldn't help chuckling at the bewilderment on his face. "Julia, you and Hanyu have met, I believe?" he said. She nodded. Briefly. True, one encounter had only consisted of her seeing the young man's distress and rushing to fetch Antony. "Then only one introduction remains. Felix, this is my attendant Hanyu. Hanyu, Felix." Felix unleashed one of those hot tea and fuzzy blanket smiles of his in Hanyu's direction and inclined his head. "It's lovely to finally meet you, Hanyu. I've heard so much about you." Hanyu went pale. "Oh dear, that can't be good." Pallor gave way to an embarrassed flush as Antony and the two new arrivals all descended into helpless laughter, Felix's booming guffaws thundering through the small cabin. Antony flopped down on the sofa and surrendered to the mirth as Hanyu turned a sulky gaze to his meal. "Forgive me," Felix managed after a moment. "I shouldn't laugh, but I promise that everything I've heard about you has been good." The offering perked up. "Really, my lord?" "Of course. Your friends from the temple are all terribly fond of you, naturally. Edgy is less effusive, I'll admit, but he says you're extremely sweet. And Theodora practically worships the ground you walk on, almost as much as he does." This last was accompanied by a jerk of his thumb in Antony's direction. Hanyu's flush deepened and spread down his neck and over his ears. "Oh, that's awfully nice of everyone." Antony didn't care for the turn the conversation had taken, or the nervous rolling that had resumed in his stomach at Felix's words. He was suddenly very eager to get down to business. "I don't imagine you two came here to deliver the results of a popularity contest," he said, almost wincing when his voice came out in a growl. No one reacted to his sudden poor humor, but at least his two lieutenants turned their attention back to him. Julia dropped down on the sofa next to him, and Felix came to stand before them. The big man had unconsciously fallen into the pose of a soldier preparing to give a report, his whole body going straight as a pen and his chin rising. Antony half expected him to salute. Despite this, Felix's voice was soft and casual as he spoke. "Julia and I think that the prisoners from the battle are ready to start integrating with the rest of the humans. Iovita's been teaching them a little Taishan. They're also ready to serve as the prisoner's interpreter for a few weeks as they adjust." "They don't seem likely to resort to anything drastic with the offerings?" Antony asked. He'd made the mistake before, releasing prisoners into the human population too early and sparking murders and even once an attempted uprising. This time, he was determined to be careful. Hanyu would be heartbroken if one of his friends in general service was harmed because some Surgish fighter wanted to squeeze in one last battle with Taisha. "I'd hardly say I'm ready to vouch for every single one of them," Julia put in. "We should keep a close watch on them, as always, but I trust them to understand that they're in the middle of the ocean and that we won't have any trouble overpowering them if they step out of line." Felix jumped in again. "They need more freedom of movement, more fresh air, and a way to get some space from one another. This much time cooped up together isn't healthy." Ever the bleeding heart, for all he was likely the deadliest vampire on the ship, well, with the possible exception of Marcus, a serious fight between the two of them would be a sight to see. "I appreciate your concern, but the safety of our offerings takes priority over our prisoners," Antony said. "I'll only allow it if we can find enough volunteers to double the guard in the general service barracks. Two of us need to be present at all times, and I don't want the prisoners wandering all over the ship, getting into the kitchens or the laundry. They have to stay in the barracks and can take their exercises at night, when we can be up there with them." Felix's eyebrows had crept steadily up his face as Antony spoke. When he wound down, the bigger man's mouth quirked into a small smile. "Those are all very sensible precautions, Lord Antony," he replied. Julia snorted. "So sensible that most of them have been part of our standard procedure for prisoners for hundreds of years. It's good to see you take an interest, though." Doing his best to cover his mortification with a scoff, Antony turned his attention back to the more sympathetic figure of Felix. "I'll see who he can find to take extra shifts in the common rooms," the bigger man said, generously ignoring Antony's embarrassment. "That's a good idea. It's much less likely for two people to both be distracted at any given moment. I agree that our first responsibility is to the offerings, and I promise you that Julia and I have always taken that responsibility very seriously." Antony still felt the need to grumble a little. "Did I ever actually put you two in charge of prisoners?" Felix looked a little uncomfortable, but Julia just shrugged, unrepentant. "You never ordered us to create and maintain the elder rooms either, but that's always gone fine. The two of us just work well together on these sort of projects. I have medical training, Felix is kind, and we're both stubborn enough to keep it up for centuries on end." "Julia's kind too," Felix put in loyally, "just in different ways. Sometimes you need to be harsh with somebody to get through to them, and I've always been hopeless at that." Antony used to be hopeless at that too, but it had never been a problem for Julia. He wouldn't have dared to disobey her most of the time, never mind the humans she tended. She softened with her apprentices, though. He used to whine that she was so much nicer to Sana than him, to which she always replied with a bland, "Well, they're much more interesting than you are." Her real voice broke into his remembered revere. "Would you like to look at them over before making your decision? Iovita's still there, so translation won't be a problem." That worked out well. "All right. Hanyu, do you mind being by yourself until Bunta comes to walk you up for exercise?" In the moment it took Hanyu to get over his surprise at being addressed, Felix spoke. "I'd be more than happy to keep you company, if that's all right. I've been eager to meet you for quite some time now." "Oh!" Hanyu blushed. Well, of course, if... my lord?" He looked over, and Antony nodded his permission. He couldn't have planned this better himself. It would probably only take 10 minutes in Felix's company for his offering to start reconsidering Antony's offer to release him to another master. Felix was wonderful. Antony's chest tightened strangely at the idea. How would it feel, that inevitable moment when Hanyu told him that he'd found someone better and finally given up on him? He was being ridiculous. It would feel like doing the right fucking thing after far too long, and that was all. "All right, then," he said, doing his best to interject some sprightliness into his tone as he got up from the sofa and extended a hand to Julia. "Shall we?" Hanyu paused in the doorway to catch Hanyu's gaze. It wasn't hard. The young man was watching him with round, nervous eyes. Was he worried about being left alone with Felix? The thought almost pulled a laugh out of Antony. If anything, he ought to be worried about abandoning Felix. The poor man was liable to be talked to death. "I'll see you later, Hanyu." He tried to make his voice reassuring. "Have a good day." When they were in the hallway, Julia spoke up. "I'm sorry for laughing at your suggestions. They were good ideas. I just forgot that you weren't familiar with the way we did things." "Oh, don't worry about it." Antony waved his hand dismissively. It was nice of her to apologize, but quite unnecessary. He'd been lax in his oversight of the prisoners they took, and if she and Felix had been kind enough to fill the gaps that he'd left, he could certainly endure a few barbs in exchange. Julia still looked worried. "I didn't mean to embarrass you in front of your lover." "What in the world?" "I'd hardly call Felix my lover. I mean, yes, we do sleep together sometimes, but I meant Hanyu." Antony stopped so suddenly that he almost fell over. He felt his mouth working into a series of useless sputters, but he couldn't force his mind to the task of assembling any kind of coherent speech. "Hanyu, lover, Hanyu, my lover, Hanyu." "We're not," he squawked after a truly humiliating amount of time had passed. "We've never... no!" Julia's eyebrows had risen throughout his fumbling. "He's not interested in sex, then?" "No!" Now he started moving again, hurling down the hallway as if he could evade this entire conversation if he just walked fast enough. "I mean, he is. He gives every indication. We're not together. Not at all." Again, Julia said, "Oh, then, that's too bad. Sorry if it's a painful topic. I guess feelings can't always be requited, can they? Let me know if you ever want to sit around commiserating and pretending we can still get drunk." Antony was saved from having to come up with an answer to this by reaching the ladder. He'd scaled his ladder 1,000 times, but this time it seemed necessary to give it his whole attention. Luckily, Julia didn't try to resume their conversation as they navigated the busy hallways. Antony might not spend much time down in the lower levels of the ship, but others did. It held Cloelia's fishing operation, the handful of hens that kept them supplied with eggs, the laundry, the rooms enchanted with chilling spells to preserve meat and other perishable goods, the elder rooms, and, of course, the prison. The prison was a large room that had probably been intended as some kind of exercise area. It was no great shakes as a terrifying dungeon, but with some cots and chamber pots dragged in, it served the purpose well enough. How long had it been since it was put to use? 70 years? The desert tribes didn't attempt to strike at Taisha very often, and even when they did, there was only a 1 in 3 chance that Antony's followers would be the ones asked to drive them off. It barely looked like it was in use as a prison even now. When Antony opened the door, he found a cluster of men, not half as thin and ragged as they had been in the night of the slaughter, sitting or sprawling around Iovita, who sat on one of the cots. Iovita was small and fine-boned, only a head taller than Antony himself, with a long face and heavy, sleepy-looking eyes that had deluded more than one poor fool of a noble back home into thinking they would be an easy mark. It had always been a mistake of the highest order. At the moment, they were speaking a steady stream of fluent Sergish, but they cut themselves off when they glanced at the door and saw who had arrived. They got to their feet and inclined their head politely. "Hello, Lord Antony," they greeted. "Goodness, Julia, you meant it when you said you'd bring him right away." Antony surveyed the captured men, who were regarding him warily. "I hear you're all in agreement that it's time to let these birds fly the coop." "I don't think they're going to try any heroics, if that's what you mean," Iovita replied with a shrug. "And I've made it pretty clear that they won't like what happens if they lay a hand on any of our offerings." "I'd like to make that even clearer. Is there one who the others listen to?" Iovita's eyes narrowed. "What are you going to do?" "For fuck's sake!" Antony was actually a little wounded by their suspicion, though he supposed it was warranted. "I wouldn't hurt him. They're prisoners. I just want to make sure he knows how seriously I, as a leader of the ship, take the safety of our offerings." Their eyebrows raised a little, a reaction which Antony seemed to be eliciting with alarming frequency today, and he braced himself to hear a justified but unwelcome variation on, "Since when?" However, Iovita just nodded. "As it happens, we were lucky enough to capture the leader of the war band," they said. "The others still listen to him." "Fine. Would you bring him over and translate for us?" The leader was small and spare, with a hard expression that did an impressive job of covering his fear as Iovita led him over to the place where Julia and Antony stood. He thudded gracelessly to his knees when he reached them, but he kept his head up and his eyes fixed warily on Antony's hands. Antony resisted the impulse to clasp them behind his back. After all, putting the man at ease was rather the opposite of his goal at the moment. Not taking his own gaze from the prisoner, Antony addressed Iovita. "I see you've told him who I am. Would you please ask him to give me his name?" Iovita doubtless knew the man's name, but they were used to playing interpreter and fell easily into old habits. When they addressed the prisoner in Sergish, Antony knew that they hadn't changed a word of his question. The leader's eyes flicked up to Antony's face, then back down to his hands. "Tay." "Tay." Antony nodded, not missing the way the prisoner flinched at the sound of his name on his enemy's tongue. "Well, Tay, if you and your followers will abide by the rules of this ship, you will be granted more freedom of movement and increased privileges." Iovita relayed this message as well, and the leader glanced up again, clearly interested. Antony met the look with his chilliest smile, making sure to display his fangs. "And if any of them feel tempted to make trouble with our Taishan offerings, I would like to invite them to remember the night we captured them, and to bear in mind that we weren't angry at the time. They should consider very carefully whether they want to anger us." "Gods, Antony," Julia muttered, as Iovita dutifully translated, and Tay's face paled. "You sound like a gangster." It was hard to imagine that she would have ever had occasion to meet one of the gang lords who had run parts of the capital city back home. Still, Antony couldn't deny the accuracy of the comparison. He scoffed. "All lords are gangsters. You should have heard the way my father used to talk. In fact, you would have if you'd ever shown up at court." Lucky for you, I spent my time apprenticing with my master instead, she shot back. You wouldn't make half as menacing a figure with your immortal guts hanging out for all eternity. Iovita turned back to them. Are you done threatening him? Judging by the look on his face, I think I've made my point. In truth, Antony felt a little bit as if he might need a bath after that thuggish display, but there was no point in whining because he succeeded in his stated goal of scaring someone. But, Iovita, I want to ask if you'd like to come by sometime. I mentioned some of your ridiculous betting stakes to my attendant, and now he's awfully curious to meet you. Did you tell him about the coconuts? Julia asked, but Iovita's face had already lit up with interest. Oh, yes, they cried. Hanyu, right? Word in the common area is that you plan to keep him once the cycle's over. How in the world had that gotten out? Had Edgy... The question had barely begun to form before Antony had to stifle a rueful chuckle and a grin that he suspected would have been too fond by half. Of course Hanyu had told everyone he knew, and probably a few people he didn't as well. That's the plan, he admitted. For now, anyway. But we left him with Felix, so I bet by the time I get back, Hanyu will be asking to move in with him instead. Iovita's eyes gleamed. Is that a real bet? Because I'll take you up on it.